All sanctions imposed, reimposed or relabeled since Donald Trump took office in the US must be lifted off Iran. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif said this early in the year, and it has been repeated time and again by the Foreign Ministry in reference to the ongoing Vienna JCPOA talks. Be it in one step or step by step, the Biden administration must give Iran a full sanctions relief. Only then and after verification will Iran recommit to the nuclear deal or JCPOA of 2015. This demand may sound like an unwise ultimatum and the cause for holding talks back. But is it? Flowing talks or hiccups in talks? Vienna has been a scene of trials and efforts in opening up a string of knots that have appeared in the JCPOA talks. Why the knots? How hard is it to see past obstacles to get the talks going and the JCPOA up and running? I'm Leila Faramarzi and you're watching Iran Today. The physical obstacles now are basically, first, Iran's demand when the US does not want to lift all sanctions. It wants to lift nothing more than JCPOA-related sanctions. But what are those? According to Iran, all sanctions are JCPOA-related because immediately after his 2018 pullout from the deal, Trump said he would impose the toughest sanctions ever to get more concessions from Iran in negotiating terms above and beyond the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We got to talk to Mr. Zangane before he gets inundated with journalists, as MPs tend to do when they leave the chamber.
These stalemates can only be broken when the European Union and the United States start to recognize the Islamic Republic as a free and independent nation with a system of government. Unless they believe that and deem Iran an enemy to their economic, military and political agenda, I'm confident that these hurdles can't be overcome. They need to recognize the dignity, independence and freedom of the Islamic Republic and put aside their hostile attitude towards Iran.
A second obstacle to Vienna talks is the demand made of Iran. The US and other Western parties to the nuclear deal demand that Iran destroy the new generation nuclear centrifuges it installed as a continuation of its remedial measures to get its JCPOA partners to re-enter or recommit to the deal. Whereas Iran maintains it only has to discontinue the centrifuges by way of the deal. Now there's a little niche, tomato, tomato. Mr. Kiomars Yazdanpanoh is a geopolitics professor with a practical look in his analyses of current affairs.
Well, closing down enrichment sites isn't that much different from destroying the enrichment machines. If a machine remains unused, it'll start to wear out after a while. This is the difference of the viewpoints, but it's evident that controlling Iran's enrichment level is a crucial and urgent issue for them. It appears that Iran is at a point where it won't be deceived again, and that the haste it made back in 2015, which resulted in the JCPOA not being beneficial to us, won't repeat.
Doesn't look like there's any easy win for Iran. The deal was signed to curb Iran's nuclear program, which this country has maintained is peaceful all along. That was in return for lifting nuclear-related economic UN sanctions off this country. The deal was between Iran and the P5+1, that's the permanent UN Security Council members. The US backed out and left Iran with the UK, France, Russia, China and Germany. The E3 of the collection, that's the three Western European powers, demonstrated no power in the face of US sanctions and were almost as ineffective as the US was destructive to the deal and to the Iranian economy it had promised to boost under the deal.
ایران باید یه ظرفیت‌سازی دیگری هم انجام بده.
Iran should build up its capacities by taking other measures, like turning to nations outside the P5+1, especially considering the capacities countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and even Pakistan have as emerging powers in Asia. These countries, which happen to have good relations with Iran, can be asked to have indirect participation in the process of talks and can be used as leverage to convince the US to put aside its negative attitude toward the JCPOA. This could bring about a brighter future in the negotiations, so the problems can be resolved.
So, on the anniversary of the US pullout, Iran started inching out of its nuclear-related commitments to the JCPOA by, say, enriching uranium up to 20, then 60% purity levels. That's way beyond JCPOA licensed levels of under 4%. It sure got the West to listen, even get into talks to revive the deal, the Vienna talks. But at what cost for this country? The talks worried Israel and radical elements in the US. Natanz, a major nuclear site off the Iranian capital Tehran, was devastated by Israeli sabotage. This was so as to discourage Iran from the talks. Instead, Iran repaired and enhanced Natanz with far more advanced centrifuges.
According to the nuclear deal, Iran has accepted to limit the level of enrichment, uranium enrichment, instead for removing sanctions. So according to if the United States is going to have or increase or some sanctions which have been imposed by the Trump administration, so it is the natural right of Iran to increase the level of enrichment. So this is a detail. This, in fact, in negotiations between Iran and the United States, this indirect negotiations, it is very important for both sides to discuss on the details, such details that you referred to. If it is going to have more sanctions, to leave some sanctions on Iran, so this is the natural right of Iran to have more nuclear enrichment. But Iran is ready, as authorities of Iran have claimed many times, Iran is ready to return to the same nuclear deal that was signed in 2015.
Israel's direct or indirect sabotage didn't stop at that. Next, after Palestine's Hamas movement retaliated to Israeli strikes on Palestinians, significantly on Monday, May the 10th, US Republicans stepped up calls on Joe Biden, 13th May, to end talks with Iran. That was in case sanctions relief untied Iran's hands to further support Hamas. Biden disagreed, but in continuing to demand Iran destroy the new generation IR-4, 6 and 9 centrifuges, among others. And that's just for now.
The JCPOA is a new means of colonization. Today, colonizing countries no longer impose their agenda with machine guns, tanks, warplanes and missiles, but with economic, financial and political tools. Take the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, for example, which aims at colonizing other nations. Their tools are different. They are monetary and financial tools denominated by the dollar. I believe the JCPOA is one of such tools, but presented nicely. It's the same concept the leader of the Islamic Revolution has said before: velvet gloves that cover iron-cast hands.
The US administration wants to return to the JCPOA as a first step. Next, it will be demanding a JCPOA Plus or even a JCPOA 2. It's no wonder Iran passed the law earlier on to give them a deadline by threatening to cease cooperation with the IAEA or UN nuclear watchdog. The Foreign Ministry negotiating team, however, sees hope with the more delicate approach of talks and continued diplomacy. Iranian parliament has pretty much alerted the US to a late May deadline for lifting sanctions off Iran and returning to the JCPOA. Get back in by then, or let's leave the JCPOA alone once and for all, so to speak. But might lawmakers here have softened their tone to give Iranian negotiators in Vienna a better chance at smoothing out the platform for a JCPOA revival? Well, I might have gotten a little carried away with this one, adding too much spice. But we've got a chief announcer and giver of ultimatums to moderate and give us a notion of the parliamentary mood. That would be Mr. Mojtaba Zonnur, head of the Parliamentary National Security and Foreign Policy Committee.
The Strategic Action Plan Act passed by the Parliament is, as the leader of the Islamic Revolution said, a good law that needs to be implemented. That's why the Parliament remains steadfast in its position regarding the law. If the May 24 deadline agreed with the IAEA Director General is missed and the Iranian government wants to extend the time, it will be found in breach of the law. The violator would be subject to Article 9 of the law, which has criminalized that and defined punishments to those who object to or obstruct the legislation. The Parliament remains firm on its position regarding the matter.
Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Said Abbas Araghchi, who is leading Iran's negotiating team in Vienna, said the deal may be extended. He did express hope, however, that enough progress will be made so that there will be no need for an extension. But if needed, Iran will consider an extension at a proper time.
We enacted several clauses in the law for lifting sanctions. One clause required the government to immediately begin ramping up Iran's nuclear activities, including installing newer generation centrifuges and reviving the heavy water sectors in Iraq, Fordo and Natanz sites. We also defined a time frame for our withdrawal from implementing the additional protocol, meaning to decrease the excess and snap inspections for the IAEA. We started playing the same game that they are.
Given that extending to the deadline might give the wrong signal and lead to misconceptions and miscalculations on the other side, that Iran isn't serious in its positions, the Parliament won't allow an extension. This is so the enemy respects our regulations and understands that once we made a commitment, it can't be changed. If we're not serious about this, the other side would understandably act negligently in performing its duties. That's why we need to stand firm in enforcing the law.
The United States has accepted much of what it ought to do, but there are also some sanctions the US is not willing to lift, said Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh. But Iran has made it clear that these sanctions were imposed to destroy the JCPOA and prevent Iran from reaping benefits from the JCPOA, and thus must be removed.
According to the nuclear deal, sanctions on Iran are categorized by two groups. First, sanctions by the executive orders and sanctions by the Congress acts. According to this deal, the United States government is committed to remove all the sanctions by the executive deal. But for sanctions by the Congress acts, the US government, the President of the United States, is committed to suspend those sanctions. So for Iran, what is important is that to remove the barriers on sanctions, on economic sanctions, which have had essential impacts on the Iranian economy.
Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. It's no secret the US wants to keep some sanctions in place to use them as leverage to expand talks beyond the JCPOA. As leverage in the follow-up talks they wish to initiate with Tehran on JCPOA timelines, as well as Iran's non-nuclear activities. The US has put sanctions into 3 baskets, green, yellow and red, depending on how clearly they are inconsistent with the deal. Green will be lifted, yellow is to be negotiated and red will stay.
این رابطه دو سطحی بین ایران و آمریکا برگزار
A
بشه.
two-level relationship between Iran and the United States that would enable the two sides to directly discuss the matters in person could help clear up some misunderstandings and improve the process of talks, because the negotiations are being held based on distrust, and while such views persist, we can't expect desired results, even on a tactical level.
Plenty more to be said, but let's make a break in our words to see what other media outlets have to say. Stay with me for a quick media review. And here's how it is in the words of others. How desperately does Iran really want sanctions lifted? The Middle East Monitor says why Iran can live without a nuclear deal. Most of the international community, barring Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, welcomes the recent developments regarding the revival of the JCPOA, especially after 4 turbulent years under the previous Donald Trump administration. But expectations of a revival of the nuclear deal do not necessarily mean that is going to happen, not in a seamless fashion anyway. After weathering the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, Iran feels both vindicated and defiant. Combined with the country's enhanced leverage in the form of more advanced centrifuges, this state of mind indicates Iran is in no mood to compromise. From an Iranian point of view, while a lasting nuclear deal may be desirable for economic reasons, it is not necessarily indispensable. The Islamic Republic can continue to thrive in the world without the JCPOA. We've got a piece by SP Global. What would it mean to Iran's rival oil producers if sanctions were lifted? Sanctions relief for Iran would pressure rival heavy crude condensate producers. 4 rounds of indirect talks between the US and Iran have so far failed to achieve a breakthrough in negotiations to revive the nuclear deal. But rival producers and traders have been eyeing how the competitive landscape may shift if sanctions are lifted on Iranian oil sales. Most experts expect an agreement on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to be reached within months, if not weeks, which could eventually bring some 2 million barrels per day of Iranian oil back to the market, 2 million barrels. Much of Iran's production is of heavier grades than condensate, and a relaxation of the sanctions will put pressure on the likes of neighboring Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Oman, and even Texas frackers. Refineries worldwide, meanwhile, will likely cheer the extra availability of Iranian crude. The refining hubs of Asia, China, India, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore, have regularly processed Iranian grades, as the high sulfur content and heavy or medium density fit the diet of these complex plants. We've got the Financial Tribune and why it matters to Iran that banking sanctions be lifted. Iranian banking industry wants definite sanctions relief. Iran is pushing for its banking industry to be given guaranteed and conclusive sanctions relief at talks to restore the country's nuclear deal with world powers. The removal of sanctions against the central bank, Iranian banks, SWIFT, and any money transfer between them and major foreign correspondent banks needs to be verified. Abdul Nasser Hemmati, the governor of the Central Bank of Iran, told Bloomberg, referring to restrictions on Iranian access to the Belgium-based global payments system. Hemmati said that officials from the central bank are directly involved in the talks to ensure US sanctions removal is tangible. Due to the sanctions imposed by Trump, deals with US companies after the 2015 JCPOA signing that were technically permitted, such as plans to purchase dozens of airliners from Boeing Company, either crept forward or were impossible to complete. Donald Trump, the controversial former US president, piled hundreds more penalties on Iranian lenders, including the central bank, as it ramped up pressure on Tehran. That would be it for this segment, but do stay tuned. Iran rejects any categorization of sanctions to partially lift them. Be they Obama-era sanctions or Trump-fancy sanctions, be they recognized as JCPOA-related or unrelated. Although Iran maintains they are all JCPOA-related and the US seems to agree deep down.
Iran
is insistent on some of its internal policies. They are also insisting that Iran abandons and readjusts those policies. It doesn't appear that the two would mix well, or the JCPOA would be able to work to Iran's benefits, albeit in a minimal way. Iran wants all sanctions removed, but many sanctions aren't JCPOA related. Even if 50% of the JCPOA related sanctions are suspended and not lifted, it would be a positive development for Iran.
Anyhow, it was the US that pulled out of the deal, disregarding UNSC Resolution 2231, which the JCPOA rests on. In other words, it was the US that caused the standoff with a mess of sanctions imposed later to sabotage the JCPOA. That was in the Trump era, but even Joe Biden for months refused to lift any sanctions before Iran takes the first step to recommitting. US pressures have only been backfiring. Here's a point. Practice of the law can only be so different from what the law says, and the way the US and allies have boldly gone about the deal as though it were never meant to lift sanctions to begin with makes you wonder just that. Was the JCPOA never meant to lift sanctions off this country, only to temporarily suspend them?
First is not the removal of all sanctions. We had this ambiguity with our colleagues in the Foreign Ministry. They said according to the JCPOA, all sanctions would be lifted without any preconditions on the date the deal was signed. But we said it won't happen for two reasons. One is the nature of the imperialist system that won't allow it, and the second is the text that was being signed. The JCPOA text has tied the lifting of sanctions to tens of preconditions. If you consider how the sanctions are planned to be removed in the JCPOA, which doesn't include all anti-Iran sanctions, you'll notice that practically nothing will happen.
Earlier on in the talks, Abbas Araghchi said Iran requires no roadmap to restore the deal. In our view, there is no step-by-step plan. We only have a final step that the US needs to take to lift the sanctions it has imposed, reimposed, or relabeled during the past 4 years. We will verify, and then Iran will return to its commitments. That's not all. Iran wants guarantees from the US and its Western European partners that sanctions won't be reimposed on this country as soon as the deal gets going. Because then the US as a member will have the power to trigger the snapback mechanism. That way, all sanctions can come flooding Iran all in one go. However, Joe Biden seems too level-headed to act outside strategy to unnecessarily cause a breach of trust. Now, are all sanctions really vital to lift? So what if high-up individuals remain on the US list of persons of interest to sacrifice themselves for the country to see oil and banking and other sanctions lifted to see its economy flourish?
Some of these sanctions are imposed on people who are active in large companies, which constitute non-governmental relations between Iran and other nations in trade, commerce, export of goods, and import and export of raw materials, and so on. Sanctioning these people has put additional pressure on Iran. These aren't serious sanctions and don't have that much legal burden on either side. If these sanctions are lifted, talks on other aspects of the JCPOA can be facilitated, which in turn can gain the trust of Tehran. So the Iranian parliament would accept to extend the deadlines it has set so the government can have the time for talks.
There is a thing called Congress in the US, but might there be any legal loopholes for individual US states to separately impose sanctions on Iran if the US returns to the deal?
Such a thing doesn't exist in the legal structure of the US. It's also incompatible with international law. It's not like any state can arbitrarily do whatever it wants. It's up to the Security Council and the President of the United States.
There is no structure already for imposing sanctions on states, and there is very few precedents for such sanctions in US history. So the second is that companies and countries do not take sanctions by separate states as serious as they take the sanctions by the federal government of the United States.
So how have details on the ground been looking in Vienna further on since a week after a fourth round of talks had begun on Friday, the 7th of May? In dismissing Republican calls to cease nuclear talks, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a good point on the same day, May the 13th. It was the straightforward answer, the sort of common-sense comment Iran has been making all along to fall on deaf ears. He said, "I don't have anything to offer on whether or not there is Iranian involvement in what is taking place in Gaza. But when it comes to any of the malign activities that Iran may or may not engage in, That only underscores the importance that we do everything we can to ensure that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. In other words, you want to curb Iran's power? Allow talks to go on in Vienna to see if we can return to mutual compliance with the JCPOA. That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team, but do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's on. Nuclear talks are ongoing and we are getting close to election day in Iran. Till next time, bye.